Get everything set up myself here. So we've jumped quite a few chapters from chapter 16 all the way up to chapter 28 here. And as I said, as I was making announcements, the reason for that is because just nothing said about Samuel. He had passed away. Nothing was obviously examined as far as his works go and those kind of things as the prophet of God and as the judge of God as in his past. But we will see a very, can I use the word unique situation here in chapter 28 that I felt was a good way to close. Instead of leaving it at his actual life, today's sermon is actually called The Afterlife of Samuel. I was impressed with my title on that one. So we're in Samuel chapter 28. And again, we're going to look at the entire chapter. We'll read the whole thing right now, but we'll just go into the verses as we are hitting them as normal. The main focus will be in starting in verse 3 and going all the way down to verse 25, but there is some information in verse 22 that we need to deal with. It kind of gives the context of what's going on. So in those chapters that we have skipped, you have information about the king, about King Saul and about David and the interactions that go on between these two men. Obviously, David isn't king yet, but there is quite a bit of information about him. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I know David was on the run twice in his life. Once from King Saul, and then afterwards it's his sin, and then Absalom, when Absalom tries to kill him. And obviously, if we do a study in the life of David, we'll go back to these verses. But like I said, too, this is not a book study that we're doing, but a character study, if you would. But in that time, and between the rest of chapter 16 all the way up here, we see that David gets called to Saul initially because of an evil spirit that's upon him. We learn in we finished in verse 13 the last Sunday we were here, and then verse 14 talks about where the Spirit of God departs from Saul because of his wickedness, but because also he was not God's king anymore. He was the ruler of Israel, but he wasn't empowered by God to do that job anymore because that office, if you would, is being shifted. But on top of that, an evil spirit comes upon him. And then David, who had just received this spirit to do the job that he would soon at some point in his life, soon's not a good word, he would later on in his life have the responsibility of, and that would be being king. But he was called to minister to Saul because of the problem, the burden or the oppression, if you would, that's going on in this man's life through music. And he goes and we find out that David played music to him, which apparently he was very good at. He had maybe a good voice, he was a good baritone, or maybe he was a tenor, who knows. But he and whatever, I don't think there's an instrument that's mentioned specifically, but not that that's important, but he was there singing in a way that was soothing to this king in that time. And I'm saying all this, and it's maybe I'm bogging down there a little bit, but in all that, in the interaction that he has, we have in chapter 17, the very famous, if you would, or well-known passage of David and Goliath. We're not going to hit that. We're not going to go in there. But you see David very readily involved in the life with Saul's son, Jonathan, and all this. But there's just constant enmity between Saul and him. And the thing is, David never was at odds with King Saul. He honestly was just trying to honor God and allow King Saul to be king, but because of Saul and his fear and his terrible character, he constantly went after David. He misinterpreted things that David did. There are actually two events that have recorded where two times when David was a military man and he had his men with him, his mighty men that were getting developed or gathered together, he had chances to kill King Saul. One specific one, the one that's closest to chapter 28, he stood beside him well, he stood beside King Saul, asleep on the ground, and could have put a spear through his head. And he had a man that was with him that recommended, this is your chance to end this trouble that you have. And David's response was, how in the world could I do that to God's anointed? The perspective, though David fails on multiple occasions, the perspective of this is God's man, and until God puts me here or takes him out or whatever, I will honor God through honoring this man. Great character, you can see. But saying all that, and again, obviously I'm building up kind of the context of what we get to. David gets run out of Israel. He goes and he resides in the camp of the Philistines, or amongst the nation of the Philistines, specifically in Gath. What about Gath and David? Anybody know how David had a connection to Gath at all? Goliath was from Gath, and he went and spent time with this man. We'll see in verses 1 and 2. Achish was the king of Gath, but he went there and was settled there after he had killed their champion. And as a matter of fact, there's so much information. I love talking about this stuff, but I'm gonna have to hone it down. But as a matter of fact, as David was fleeing, he actually gets Goliath's sword. And he has Goliath's sword with him as a weapon because he didn't have one. And this, from the account in chapter 17, this was a very large sword, even though David was a bigger man. And there were 600 men with David in the camp of the Philistines. It wasn't just him by himself. He took 600 of his mighty men with him. And this will lead us up to the point where we're going to be at here in chapter 28. So, by way of introduction, since I wrote a nice one out, I'm going to read it as I normally do. So we have traced the events of the life of God's man Samuel. Samuel was dedicated to the service of Yahweh, or the Lord, before he was even born. His name, if you'll recall, means asked of God. Remember, because this is a study of the life of Samuel, remember Hannah, Samuel's mother, had begged for a son, and we'll get into the details there, and God provided, even though she had been barren and being ridiculed about that. But Samuel's name meant asked of the Lord. And he would have recalled that. That would have been something he would have known that about his personal history. It could have been a driving factor for him to follow God. But his name meant basically asked of the Lord. He had a constant reminder there of the faithfulness of God's answered prayer. Samuel also was placed in the care of Eli to train up as a priest of God. He grew up in a terrible environment and was faced with difficult decisions at the inception of his ministry as the prophet of Yahweh. These issues were the catalyst for growth, and he chose to obey God rather than to oppress man. If you recall, as a young, speculatively speaking, Samuel was between the ages of 7 and 12 when God spoke to him in the tabernacle that night, or that early morning. And the prophecy the first prophecy he was going to give was the announcement of judgment upon Eli, this man who was raising him. Remember, his parents weren't raising him. But he had to come because of the wickedness of Eli and of Hophni and Phinehas. Hophni and Phinehas, horrible people. These priests that were taking advantage of people in ways we don't even really want to talk about. And then Eli, though he wasn't involved in those things, he let them happen. But yet he was still the man that raised Samuel, that trained him up to teach him to know who the Lord was, and even told him, this is who is speaking to you, Samuel, as you hear this voice in the night, and you say, here I am, and you run to me and ask, no, that's God talking to you. But Samuel had to pronounce judgment on this very man. And can you imagine the difficulty of between 7 and 12 years old, you have to go tell this man, you are going to die, and your sons are going to die, and God is not with you anymore. Well, what did that do for Samuel? Did he make him want to shirk duties? No. I really think that was the catalyst, the deciding factor for him I'm going to follow God in the most difficult of circumstances. And we see that to be the case with this man in his life. Samuel had a consistent character of obeying God, even in the most unsavory situations. He was well respected and established amongst the Jewish people, and he had moments when even his faith was tested, and he wasn't sure how God was going to work in these things. He feared for his life at times, but you know what Samuel did? He went to God first instead of making a knee-jerk reaction or having the same mentality as we called it the last time we were here. I won't say last week, a few Sundays ago, where it is that mentality, oh, it's better to ask forgiveness than it is permission. And that kind of makes sense in the human mind, but in reality, it's probably not a motto you want for your life. That was Saul's motto. It's better for me to just go make my own decision and then ask God to forgive him from doing something bad. Very bad idea, but that was not Samuel. He was given the responsibility to name two of Israel's kings, Saul, and then Israel's greatest king, David. He announced them, he anointed them, he prepared the nation for them. Even though David didn't see the throne until after Samuel's death. He proclaimed the word of the Lord regarding the downfall of Eli and again of Saul, and would have that wonderful privilege to announce David as being king, or to anoint David as being king. So today we finish our series in the life of Samuel, and we will see how his spirit lined up with his previous teachings. And when I say his spirit, I don't know what else to call it than that. Well, this is the situation in chapter 28. Samuel's dead, but he gets to talk again. So I'm going to call it a spirit. Go start real. We'll lay that foundational point here. Go start real. But his spirit does interact with Saul at some point here. But we see it lined up with the way the man was in his earthly ministry. So let's take a look at the afterlife of Samuel. Verses 3 through 14, we see Saul's wickedness. So at this point in King Saul's monarchy, he was chosen to be Israel's. That word isn't chosen, and I have no idea what that word is. So at this point in Saul's ministry, let me go off the cuff here. He was winding down this position as king. And he is in a bad position. He was in a bad place. And David was chosen to be king. He was anointed. Whether it has gotten out and whether, I think at this point Saul understood that David was going to replace him. Verses 1 and 2 say this, and it came to pass in those days that the Philistines gathered their armies together for warfare to fight with Israel. And Achish said unto David, remember, this is why David is with the Philistines. We talked about that just now. So Achish said unto David, know thou assuredly that thou shalt go out with me to battle, thou and thy men. And the men, that group of men was around 600 of David's best warriors. In verse 2, and David said unto Achish, surely thou shalt know what thy servant can do. And Achish said to David, therefore will I make thee keeper of mine head forever. You're going to be my bodyguard, David, forever. So David was with Achish here, king of Gath. David was not leading an insurrection. 2 times. He didn't need an insurrection. 2 times David, as the Lord allowed it to happen, and his ability to be ninja stealth, had an opportunity to kill Saul in the camp and kill him and leave his body there and be miles away before anyone woke up and found him there. So to think that he was here now leading an insurrection would have been, it doesn't make any sense. So that's not what David is doing here with the Philistines. He's just there because it's safer for him to be there. And he was doing his best, actually, to honor the Lord and his king. David was committed or commanded to ride here with Achish and the Philistines and to attack Israel. And just for background's sake, the Philistine army was much larger than the Israelite army at this time, at least in this battle. And we'll find that out through Saul's responses here. So we see here, moving on, verses 3 through 14, Saul's wickedness. We see Samuel's death in the very first part of the verse. It says, now Samuel was dead. And this had happened in the past. We learned about that earlier. Now Samuel was dead, and all Israel lamented him and buried him in Ramah. Remember, that's his city. And Saul had put away those that had familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Other translations translate the familiar spirits as mediums or as witches. In today's vernacular, I think it's not a thing I really think about or talk about much. I think mediums is a pretty common modern term for the job title, if you would. And then wizards would be connected with necromancy, which was dealing with the dead, talking with the dead. the attempted raising from the dead, those kind of heinous practices that we know are wickedness. So we see here these two things. Samuel was dead, and Saul, for whatever reason, was pulling these people out of the land. Israel had lost her faithful servant, faithful spiritual leader. Samuel was constantly there for these people. He was someone who could be depended on. Saul could never be mistaken for a spiritually astute person at all. No one was going to confuse Saul, though he was their king, as this great spiritual giant. He rarely got things right with the Lord. Saul had no doubt removed these witches or these mediums and these necromancers or wizards, as the text here says this morning, from the land because of Samuel's influence. So Saul removed these people because of Samuel's influence in the life of this man and even in the land. So not only was there that influence, but Saul also had the command available to him back in the Pentateuch, in the earlier chapters of the Bible, earlier books of the Bible, that talked about you stone these people to death. They do not need to live. You stone them. That was God's command there. And just, again, in light of what's going to be going on here, the term is familiar spirit is used, and that's talking about witches. I think that's other translations, like I said, call them that, or mediums. The work here that was involved was very obviously demonic. Demonic possession could have come about because of these things. There were, we know scripturally there are supernatural accounts where there's interactions with demons and things like that go on. But demon possession and those things kind of go hand in hand with what's going on. But this account is different. Verse 4, it says, "And the Philistines gathered themselves together and came and pitched in Shunem, and Saul gathered all Israel together, and they pitched in Gilboa. So there we have just some background on where they were going to do their fight, or their battle here. Verse 5, we have the impetus for Saul's wickedness. And when Saul saw, say that 5 times real fast. So when Saul saw the host of the Philistines, he acted in the typical way. He was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. In typical fashion here, Saul looked on the outward situation, and he feared those things. So how is he going to respond in light of all this? Just stepping back from a second from the text here and thinking about our own lives. The believer first, is any difficult, scary situation that comes up in our lives, we cannot forget who God is. God had made himself very clear to Saul. It wasn't that he was in the more difficult circumstances than anyone else. But Saul just never remembered who God was. So whenever anything scary comes up in our lives, anything, first go to, I know who God is. I know he's in control. I know he's all powerful. I know he has a plan and that nothing is going to thwart his plan. And especially if I'm walking with the Lord, I know he's going to take care of me. That can be unpacked a little better than the way I phrased that, but I know the Lord's going to take care of me. I do not need to be afraid, and I definitely don't need to start doing things on my own, like Saul here, trying to figure out an answer to the difficulty that's going on, as opposed to going to God first. And as believers, we need to always do that. Be willing to go to God first, even though how difficult a situation may be. Verse 6, it says, "And when Saul inquired of the Lord answered him not, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets." So these were kind of the typical methods to approach the Lord. He would come to them through dreams. The Urim and the Thummim were stones that were connected to the high priest's garment, and there was a way where the Lord spoke. There's not a lot of detail on how that happened, but the Lord spoke through these things, answered questions and things. And he also, obviously we know he did that through prophets, and God's prophet was not there. So Saul did inquire of the Lord, but after the Lord's judgment, he would have known that he wasn't going to get help. Remember, way back, the kingdom was torn from Saul because of his disobedience, because he did not fulfill that prophecy, because he did not obey God to destroy the Amalekites completely. And God said, "I am done with you. So the fact that Saul was even going to the Lord, he should have known nothing good was going to come of this. God had already given his answer because of his absolute lifestyle of rebellion. It wasn't because he just wanted to pick on Saul, because Saul was just doing his best, trying to do what was best. Saul opposed God at every turn in his life. And the Lord finally was just like, we're done. Your end is coming. And actually this event right here will be the end of his life. So Saul's pursuits, even in this, were self-motivated, and he was not content with God's answer that he received earlier on. Verse 7, we see Saul's wicked actions. Then said Saul unto his servants, seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit. And that's why I said demon possession. Maybe that was the case. We just don't have any detail of what's going on, but this is the way it's phrased here. Seek me a woman that hath a familiar spirit, that I may go to her and inquire of her. And his servant said to him, behold, there is a woman that hath a familiar spirit at Endor. Saul's actions shed light on what he did in verse 3. He got rid of the witches, and he got rid of those familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. But Scripture says you need to destroy them. But instead, he did, in typical Saul fashion, kept them on the back burner in case he needed to go to them. Heart was not in it. His motives weren't in what he did there in verse 3. But he went and found the woman that he had cast out of the land, got rid of so they couldn't be depended upon. And lo and behold, he just happened to know that he could still go to them. Depending on himself, self-motivated. Look how easily he returned to the witches he had banished. He had no problem doing it. This is very typical for someone who's not being honest, where their motives aren't true, aren't right. We set sin at times on the back burner and say, I will enjoy it when it's convenient for me and when I feel like I'm good enough to maybe stand up to the potential consequences of sin. How easily is sin accessed in your own life? Do you have those same things? Those pet sins that, I'm doing good here, but, if I ever, for whatever reason we want to use those things, I have some sort of emotional reason to go back there and to enjoy sin for a season. Don't be like Saul. Be like Samuel and do what he did. That's kind of the thrust of the message the last time we were here, where he hacked up and destroyed, I can't remember his name at the moment, not Amalek, but the king of the Amalekites, because he represented sin and rebellion against God. That's the way we treat sin. Verse 8, and Saul disguised himself and put on other garments, and he went, and 2 men with him, and they came to the woman by night. And he said, I pray thee, divine unto me by the familiar spirit, and bring me him up, whom I shall name unto thee. So Saul's character is seen in his actions here. He disguised himself because he was ashamed of being hypocritical. He disguised himself to disguise the shame of hypocrisy. He went at nighttime to prevent anyone else from seeing him. And he used authoritative language. These are commands that he sends to this woman. You're going to divine for me. You're going to bring up for me, who I command you to do this. He used his authority even to do this, even though he wasn't known as Saul at this particular moment because he was disguised. Verse 9 says, and the woman said unto him, behold, thou knowest what Saul hath done. So she's obviously deceived at this point. How he hath cut off those that have familiar spirits and the wizards out of the land. Wherefore then layest thou a snare for my life to cause me to die? So even the witch or the medium here had the foresight to see danger about doing what she was commanded not to do. Verse 10 goes on and says, and Saul sware to her. This is important to listen to what Saul is saying, the words that he chooses to use, the authority he chooses to go back to. And Saul sware to her by the Lord, by Yahweh, saying, as the Lord liveth, there shall no punishment happen to thee for this thing. So we're considering what he's saying here. He says, I promise by the God who's condemned this, by the God I'm rebelling against, though this woman did not know this, Saul knew this. I'm going to lean on God on this. God, he will forgive me for this. Better to ask forgiveness than it is permission. I'm going to call on God, and I'm going to give her encouragement and say, I promise you by the God of Israel. And she would have thought, hold on a second here. Yahweh is the one that wanted me destroyed. And then he goes on and says, and he bases this on the Lord's attributes. The Lord will not destroy you. He ignores God's hand in the punishment that he had said was going to come about. Saul was apathetic, depraved, and self-centered. Verses 11 and 12 say, Then said the woman, Whom shall I bring up unto thee? And he said, Bring me up Samuel. And when the woman saw Samuel, she cried with a loud voice, and the woman spake to Saul, saying, Why hast thou deceived me? For thou art Saul. So recognition came at this point. In these verses we have the practices of what went on here. Again, there's no detail of what goes on, but what we do know, because we do interpret God's word literally, unless it shows us for some reason that it's set up in a way that we should not. And they're like, for instance, figurative speech, but typically it's not just left. Figurative speech isn't just left to the unknown and you get to make up the definition. And the reason I say all this is because according to God's word, and if it is authoritative and true always, this man was raised up where his spirit was. But again, this was a very unique situation. So we have the actions of what went on there. In verse 13, it says, And the king said unto her, Be not afraid. Isn't that kind of hypocritical? I am terrified. I'm coming to you doing what I shouldn't be doing. But you don't need to be afraid. You follow my example. Whatever. And the king said unto her, Be not afraid, for what sayest thou? And the woman said unto Saul, I saw gods ascending out of the earth. So Saul's words of comfort were hypocritical. She should have been afraid. She did that which God had condemned. Saul's fear has always been his downfall. How could he possibly have tried to encourage her not to be afraid when he himself was afraid? Verse 14, And he said unto her, What form is he of? And she said, An old man cometh up, and he is covered with a mantle. And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed himself. Here, Saul's piousness, if I'm using this word obeisance, I think is right, it's the right pronunciation. His worship of the situation that's going on, his worship of Samuel even, just showed the pagan mentality of his mind. He was perfectly content to do those things. But Samuel had been contacted. So concluding real quick in this section, and I've got less time than I desire this morning, but concluding here, do not let the fear of your situation drive you to disobedience. Do not, and I've already talked about that a little bit already, but that's what, when you get overwhelmed emotionally, and specifically, let's say with fear in this case, as with Saul, it drove him to disobey because he completely ignored God. But do not let that be the case for you in your own life. Saul's actions started with fear, then moved to deceit and disobedience. And it's just like any sin. It never just stays there in that little neat package that you view it as. It always is hideous and grows and encompasses way more than you think you can control. Verses 15 through 19, we have really the last words of Samuel. So some thoughts that I want to kind of handle before we get into this section. First, Samuel was actually contacted by this witch. This happened. There's no reason to argue that or to try to explain it away. And it can't be explained away as a delusion or anything like that if we take God's word seriously. The account is also one of a few one-time occurrences of demonic practices having real consequences here. So this does not give us the right to go and start labeling everything some sort of supernatural encounter. And I say that carefully because I know the Lord allows Satan to work in different ways, especially when you hear about things that go on in the mission field, and we hear about demonic practices that have a very physical response in those things. So I'm not saying that can't happen, but ultimately what we're saying here is this is a real event. It really happened. So there's no point in trying to explain it away as if this didn't occur or was some sort of illusion or delusion. Samuel speaks in verse 15, and he says, "And Samuel said to Saul, Why hast thou disquieted me, to bring me up? And Saul answered, I am sore distressed, I'm terrified, I'm afraid, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me, and answer me no more, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called thee, that thou mayest make known unto me what I shall do." All we know here about Samuel in this situation, he was disturbed. Saul's practice here was self-motivated. We understand that very clearly too. Because I need to know that I'm going to win this battle. This is about me. I am doing a practice of which God condemned. God's not talking to me, then maybe you will talk to me. Saul would not take no for an answer. He knew God had rejected him. God does not remove his spirit, and that's one thing I'll kind of deal with here, because we found out he removed the spirit from him as a king earlier on in the book. last time we were in here. But again, just for your own sakes, for us today, God does not remove his Holy Spirit from the believer today. But the Christian can stifle the work of the Spirit. That's not something that we have to worry about with God in our own lives. Once that Spirit indwells us as a Christian, he stays. So then you ask yourself this question. Are your actions Holy Spirit empowered? Or are you trying to make things happen on your own? Have you stifled the Spirit in your life because of living in sin, because of rejecting what God has told you and asked you to do? Hopefully that's not the case. Verse 16, we see Samuel is the same man as he was before he had died. Then it said Samuel, "Wherefore then dost thou ask of me, seeing the Lord is departed from thee and is become thine enemy?" Samuel's spirit did not claim any sort of supernatural power to do what God had refused to do or even couldn't do. He didn't interact in that way, but he glorified God instead. Samuel reminded Saul of his position before God, even at this point in his life. You are at enmity with God. And that's not because God wanted to use you as an example of an enemy he can have on earth. It's because you chose to be that enemy, Saul. Verse 17, "And the Lord hath done to him as he spake by me. For the Lord hath rent the kingdom out of thine hand and given it to thy neighbor, even to David." Samuel focused on the faithfulness of God here in his response, even in his death. Verse 18, because thou obeyest not the voice of the Lord, nor executed his fierce wrath upon Amalek, therefore hath the Lord done this thing unto thee this day. So Saul's rebellion to God's prophesied purpose is recalled here. Here is Samuel's spirit as he's reminding Saul, this is because of you. You've brought this on your own head. Saul could not escape the consequences of his sin. Verse 19, we see Samuel's final words. It's the last thing we will hear from God's great man, Samuel. It says, "Moreover, the Lord will also deliver Israel with thee into the hand of the Lord, or hand of the Philistines. And tomorrow shalt thou and thy sons be with me. The Lord also shall deliver the host of Israel into the hand of the Philistines." Can you see the sovereign control of God in this? How he has control over man, how he has control even over Samuel. Samuel was still the prophet of God even in his death here. And the consequences of Saul and his sin even went as far as to put the nation in danger. The nation's army, the nation's people, because they were going to be defeated and they were going to have to deal with that defeat without a king even, because Saul's life would be ended at that point. So before you choose to sin, because I would say this is probably the case with most people, but when the Spirit convicts you about something you're getting ready to do, and he makes it clear that this is sin, and you choose to do that, let's say you choose to go and say, you know what, I'm going to do this because you know what, I got things under control. please consider the consequences. That they go way past just you. They go to those around you. They affect you. They affect your family. They affect your church. They affect people at your work, people you are involved in. Sins have consequences. It's a lot larger and broader than you think of most of the time. And the thing is that there's that opportunity, and let's say you've walked right into that, or you continued forward into that sin, you can always stop there and then ask for forgiveness. The Lord is ready to do that. Confess those things and get right. And finally, here, verses 20 through 25 here, and I'm going to finish this. I know it's right at 12, but I'm going to take a few more minutes. The witch's fear we see in these verses. Mighty Saul, the handsome, head and shoulders above all king, has seen his demise. In verse 20 it says this: Then Saul fell straightway all along on the earth, and was sore afraid because of the words of Samuel. And there was no strength in him, for he had not eaten. He had eaten no bread all the day, nor all the night. Saul's fear had led him terribly from the Lord. Had led him terribly far from the Lord. He obeyed his fears and acted on them. He had succumbed to those things. Here is your example, believer, Christian. Here is your example of what it looks like to live in fear and not trust God. Because that's what living in fear is. It is a lack of trust in God. That God is in control, that God is doing something. That He is at work, though you may not be able to see precisely what's going on. It's not because He's turned a blind eye to you. I think that's the way you say that. Turned away from you and not being involved in your life, and you're all alone in the world. Fear, living in that, is a lack of trust in God. Verses 21 through 25. I'll read all these and then we'll conclude. And the woman came unto Saul and saw that he was sore troubled. Multiple times in the passage it shows the fear of this man. And said unto him, Behold, thine handmaid hath obeyed thy voice, and have put my life in my hand, and have hearkened unto thy words which thou spakest unto me. Now therefore I pray thee, hearken thou also unto the voice of thine handmaiden, and let me set a morsel of bread before thee, and eat, that thou mayest have strength when thou goest out thy way. But he refused and said, I will not eat. Do you see the petulant attitude of this child king? But his servants, together with the woman, compelled him, and he hearkened unto their voice. So he arose from the earth and sat upon the bed. And the woman had a fat calf in the house, and she hastened and killed it, and took flour and kneaded it, and did bake unleavened bread thereof. And she brought it before Saul and before his servants, and they did eat. Then they rose up and went away that night. So in these verses, the witch here of Endor knew her life hung by the word of this deceitful man. He has deceived her when he came into that door, not showing who he was. And yet she knew, this is the king of Israel who sent us away, and here I am. So she knew her life hung in his hands, hung by the balance. She took compassion on him instead. And with the hope of being spared, she prepared food for him. She tried to comfort her in whatever way she could. She was not a worshiper of the Lord. So what she could offer was nothing. But she did her best. She showed human compassion, at least, in the process of all this. And this is, again, obviously, this is not a case where we're trying to promote or look softly on the wickedness of her profession, if you would. It was absolutely an abomination to what she was doing. But the Lord used that account, used that thing to bring up his servant Samuel to do one last thing in glorifying himself. Samuel was a man of God who seemed to live in fearful circumstances on a consistent basis. He feared God more, though, because he trusted in God's faithfulness. Saul looked good outwardly. He had an opportunity to surrender. Again, this wasn't just a man whom God happened to be opposed to the whole time in his life. But no, Saul, he was flawed. And he had an opportunity to do right. and to be used by God. But he chose instead to just focus on himself and to look good to those around him. So I ask this morning, what kind of Christian will you be? When fearful events happen, how are you going to respond? Are you going to show the faithfulness of God in your life? Not that you can't be afraid, not that you can't admit to those things. Samuel did that as well. That, God, I am terrified of what's going to happen here. But Lord, you said you're in control, so I'm going to trust in that. And I'm going to do my best to be a light to those around me of your faithfulness. That's the attitude we have to have. And finally, sins, as they always do, they have consequences that are broader and a lot more far-reaching and long-lasting than you would think about when you're considering committing them. So think about things before you make bad choices. Don't be like Saul here and have that mentality of asking forgiveness because I'll definitely not get permission for what I want to do. And if that be the mindset, maybe that's the Spirit saying, if you got to do it in that way, you probably shouldn't do it. Well, that ends our series in the life of Samuel. Hopefully